Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight for our first webinar in our Clayton Engaged Housing webinar series. We're going to focus this webinar on learning about housing developments and its impacts on Clayton. This is going to be a multi-part series, and topics will largely be determined on audience feedback. This first topic is going to be a housing overview and how it relates to Clayton. We're going to look for this to be an interactive discussion. We're going to share some info with you. We're also going to engage the audience with some poll questions, and we're going to stop for audience questions toward the end. So you'll see on the bottom of your Zoom bar, you will see a chat function. Feel free to put the questions in there and we will retrieve them as we get closer to the end of the discussion. We're going to break out tonight's discussion into three core topics. First topic around the housing crisis and how we got here. Second, around the regional housing needs assessment and housing element process, better known as RHNA process. And third, we're going to talk about the changing landscape. There's a lot of legislation that's been coming down from Sacramento that affects how we assess housing projects at the local level. And so we'll talk about that toward the end of the discussion. But first, we're going to kick off into our first poll question for the evening. Okay, so this poll question is, what's your level of understanding of California housing laws and the regional needs assessment RHNA process? So I'll give folks a couple of minutes to answer those questions. And in the meantime, we will start with introductions. So Tuya, if you'd like to kick us off.
Great, thank you, and good evening. So I'm Tuya Catalano. I've been serving on the Clayton City Council for almost 4 years. And prior to that, I was on the Planning Commission. So I am a land use attorney by occupation, working mostly in San Francisco, which is a very different setting when compared to Clayton. But what I've noticed in Clayton, that whenever we have code changes or other legislative action at the City Council, although those hearings are noticed, often very few people attend. And whenever we have development proposals in front of the Planning Commission or the City Council, more people attend, but the hearing format is not very conducive to being educational. And at that point, it's really more about the project. So I know that it's easy to catch sort of snippets from social media, but the housing laws in California are quite complicated, and the sheer volume coming from Sacramento in the last few years is a lot for anybody to keep track of. So I think we need something else to provide an early opportunity for people in Clayton to learn, so that everyone can participate in hearings in order to be part of finding solutions based on fact, and in order to be able to provide meaningful feedback. So this year in the Olivia project hearings, I heard a lot of people say that they simply did not like the project and therefore it should be denied. And as a decision maker, the unfortunate thing is that liking or disliking something is really not a legally defensible or fiscally responsible way for the city to proceed when it comes to decision where the state housing laws are involved. So from my perspective, the reason why I wanted to be part of this webinar series is really out of a desire to have more people be informed and part of the discussion, not just emotionally, but from a fact perspective. I want people to participate in the hearings that we have about the housing element and related things. So I personally believe that if we can engage everyone to learn more, to participate in the hearings, to provide input and constructive feedback on solutions, the better we as a city can manage the state requirements. And I want to echo that, importantly, this webinar is really intended solely as an educational and informational series. We're not here to advocate for anything, and nothing that is said today should be construed to be either in favor or against housing. And I know as a council member, sometimes we get called out for not providing enough information. So this webinar is intended to do exactly that, to provide information on a topic that we as a city have to address from the housing element perspective very soon.
Thank you, Tuya. And I'm Terry Denslow. I'm one of your 5 planning commissioners here in Clayton. And I want to briefly tell you about a story about a housing development project happening in Lafayette. So you may ask, why do I want to talk about a project that's happening in Lafayette when we're here to talk about Clayton? Well, the reason that I want to talk to you about this is I think it's a good example that every city should read about, learn about. To learn what happens when a city and its constituents are not working together collaboratively to come up with the best overall outcome. So about 8 years ago or so, a developer came to Lafayette, said that he wanted to develop a project. It was called the Terraces, a 315 unit moderate income apartment complex that would be the largest residential structure in the city. The developer brought it forward to the city, and the residents were vehemently opposed to it. The city manager at the time thought, this is not going to go well. So he took the initiative upon himself to reach out to the developer and sit down and asked him to consider a different project, one that was a better fit for Lafayette as a community. The developer agreed. They put together a new project called the Deer Hill, which was a 44 unit single family homes with a dog park, athletic fields, etc. And they started to move forward on that project, which was a much better fit for Lafayette as a community. Though shortly before they brought it forward, the city manager received a phone call from a housing advocacy group that was very pro high density housing. They were angry that this high density project was no longer a part of the plan, and they set forward a lawsuit, which ended up they ended up settling the lawsuit and moving forward still with the 44 units plan, the 44 unit plan. They brought it forward to the city council. It was approved, but before they could break ground, a group called Save Lafayette, who was against any development at all in Lafayette, sued the city and forced to put it on a referendum, which it was voted down by the residents, and the city rescinded the approval on the project. So now the Deer Hill project was gone. And at this point, it looked like Save Lafayette accomplished their mission, right? They kept Lafayette the way it was without development. But alas, the developer was motivated and wanted to bring his project forward, and it's his right to do so. And in today's environment, there's a lot of mandates from the state that are really pro-developer. So he brought it back. The 315 unit project brought that back. He included this time affordable housing in it, which makes it very difficult for the city to legally reject the project. So it was brought back forward to the Planning Commission. It was approved by the Planning Commission and is in the appeal stage right now with the City Council. They heard the project on Monday of this week, the first of what will be 2 sessions. The first session was 9 hours and went to almost 2 in the morning before they decided to continue it forward. And from what I understand, they didn't even get fully through all of the public comments. I suspect that when they bring that back forward, that it's unlikely that they're going to reject this project, as the city looks to face $15.75 million in legal fees and a 3rd lawsuit in just an 8-year time over one project, if they do. So all in all, the situation is kind of sad to me. The collaboration needed to minimize the impact of a motivated developer with state mandates on his side just wasn't there. The city will likely end up with the project that's less of a fit for their community, and they would have spent millions of dollars on legal fees with really nothing to show for it. So while these webinar series are not about advocacy, I personally advocate that it behooves all of us to stay educated and stay engaged so we can work together and come to the best solutions for our community. Now, Peter.
Thanks, Terry. So I'm Peter Cloven. I am a 14-year resident of Clayton. I'm a 5th generation California, so in my 55 years, I've seen a lot of changes in California over time. I want to first start off by saying that this topic is dry as hell. And I get the fact that you're actually sitting here right now listening to us means that you find it somewhat interesting, and you really want to learn more about it. And I want to let you know I appreciate that. From my experience, I've been here 14 years, and the first 8 years of living in Clayton, I was blissfully unaware of politics in Clayton. Didn't know a damn thing. And that all changed 6 years ago when I got a postcard from the city of Clayton about a development across the street from my backyard, Silver Oak. And when I looked at the postcard, I'm like, okay, we got high density housing on 14 acres. My original thought was the city has already blessed this. They pre-approved it. It's a foregone conclusion it's going to happen, and there's nothing we can do to stop it. Didn't know any different. I mean, I got a postcard saying this development's going in next door. So my reaction was I was angry. Now, I was angry because it was the first time I heard about the project, and that was the city's fault. There should have been a much better communication with me and residents well before that project even got presented to me the way it did, so I could have some leverage to have conversations with my neighbors. But as it was, we were angry. And I'm an environmental scientist, so I work with real estate and development, and I knew the 14 acres of land which the developer used to calculate his density was not all usable land. As a matter of fact, because of its proximity to the creek and the steep slopes in the property, significant quantity of that property was not actually usable land, and I would object to the fact that they used the density of all the acreage to calculate how many houses you could build on the house, on that property. So what we did, we had a coalition of neighbors. That's the only thing we could do. We had 40 of us that got together from across the way on Yolanda Circle to all around Clayton Greens, and we sat down at Scipolini's and then individual backyards and living rooms to discuss what we could do to fight this darn thing. Now, we're very fortunate in Clayton to have some very astute professionals. We had a geotechnical engineer, we had a hydrologist, we had another civil engineer. I'm an environmental scientist. We were able to pick apart the environmental documentation that the developer provided, because quite frankly, it was a piece of crap. And we were able to come with our technical documentation and present that in front of the city council, and at first actually present that in front of the planning commission. Now at that time, Tuya Catalano and Keith Hayden were on the planning commission. They weren't on the city council yet. They hadn't been elected yet. And you know what? Both Keith and Tuya and the planning commission listened to us. It took copious notes. And what resulted in our making those presentations and having technical arguments against that density was the drafting of an ordinance relative to calculating densities based on usable land relative to sensitive land uses like proximities to creek and slopes. The Silver Oak project didn't pencil out the way it had originally been proposed by what we did as a neighborhood coalition. Now, why is that important? It was our comments that made that happen. And I learned by experience that the city planning commission and the city council will listen to educated, informed constituents. That's what we desire. We need your help. The city planning commission, the city council, and the city staff are not flawless. They make mistakes, and they will make mistakes. And if you're informed and you have the right people, you can actually bring good quality technical arguments to rebut what they're doing. That's why I became a planning commissioner. As soon as I found that we can make a difference, I jumped in, and I've been doing it for the last 3 years. And as part of this discussion tonight, I want to encourage all of you out here listening to actually understand what's happening, what's coming onto us as a city, so that you can help us form and shape the Clayton that saves the character of who we are. Because without your voice, you're leaving it up to people who they care, but maybe don't have all the information. And that's what I got for you guys.
All right. Thanks, Peter. Let's see what the audience said. All right.
If you're looking at the numbers, we got 43% don't know much at all about housing, and 50% say they somewhat understand. And 7% know more than average. You know what? That's kind of what I expect. I actually expected more of the not at all. I mean, because what you're going to learn tonight is pretty important. I mean, relative to what's coming towards us. So
Great.
what I want to talk about next is how we got here. Now, like I said, I've lived in California all my life, a fifth generation, born in 1964. Everything was pretty good back in the 60s growing up. The Federal Fair Housing Act was enacted in 1968. California responded in 1969 by mandating that certain jurisdictions, or jurisdictions in general, would create a certain plan to allow affordable housing for all income levels. In 1978, something happened. It was called Prop 13. Now, Prop 13, for all of you who are Jarvis tax guys, and you loved what that did for your property taxes, but it caused a real shift in California. When we weren't able to, when we capped residential taxes, that meant the new housing costs would actually cost more than the services it was brought by taxes. So what the cities is, they shifted from getting housing development into getting commercial industrial development to get the higher tax base. And as a result of that, you had more jobs coming in from that commercial industrial housing and less housing being built. And it caused more opportunity. Well, it also caused the housing that was going to be built to actually cost more because they were tacking on more fees. As you can see, that at that point, housing prices started to diverge significantly from the rest of the nation in 1970s, late 1970s. So recognizing that, the California passed in 1982, the California Housing Accountability Act. Now, that's also called the Anti-NIMBY Act. And for those of you who don't know the acronym, NIMBY is not in my backyard. It's pretty clear. And what it did is it required cities to encourage development by reducing local government's ability to reject housing projects. It's quite simple. They wanted to implement specific denial criteria and reporting criteria. And that kind of foisted on the beginning of the first RHNA cycle. Now, you're going to hear this term many times tonight, RHNA. That's an acronym of this RHNA, which stands for the Regional Housing Needs, Regional Housing Needs Assessments. Each municipality was given a certain amount of density that they were supposed to zone for in each cycle. It's been used several times. We're coming up on the sixth cycle of RHNA. It mandates housing density and zoning requirements at the municipal level. We've been doing this for quite a while. What changed? Well, in 2015 and 2016, there was a huge change. Housing advocacy groups like YIMBY, which you'll hear more about, which is yes in my backyard, began to successfully engage cities and challenge them in legal battles. In a nutshell, cities were, while they were creating for plans for housing, they weren't being developed. They were using local land use regulations and community resistance as an excuse not to build what they had already planned for. So while they rejected some of the development that they had, developers had brought forth per the plan, housing advocacy groups like YIMBY started suing the municipalities saying, hey, it's against the Housing Accountability Act. It's misaligned with your Housing Accountability Act. And as such, it caused some significant log jams, delays, and legal expenses. YIMBY, as a matter of fact, has been very, very successful in litigation targeting cities that have rejected projects because of the HA, the Housing Affordability Act. 2017, things really started to change. I mean, there's been and Tuya will get into this, there's been so much legislation that's been passed that has been pro-development, particularly affordable housing development. Every year it increases, and much to the chagrin of municipalities, you can't stop it. Add on top that one more layer. As part of his campaign for governor, Gavin Newsom basically said, hey, listen, I'm going to call for an unprecedented response to the California housing crisis. He pledged that his administration was going to help spur the biggest wave of home building in modern history. He promised he was going to launch a statewide affordable housing program that was on par with the nation's effort to rebuild Europe after World War II. I mean, that's what we're dealing with, is the state going right at us as the community, but every other community in California. Very simply put, the last 5 years states' mandates have reduced our ability for local control at the Planning Commission and City Council level to exert control over our own housing, and it's making it illegal to reject projects. You got successful groups like GIMBY making legal precedents that are passing and being used against other municipalities. While we're trying to fight these mandates, most cities who are in these very expensive legal battles have relinquished their rights to fight and being penalized with costly lawsuits, fines, further loss of control, and a loss of access to state funding and grants. A little more, I would say, a softer slide, because I get a little worked up when I hear about all this stuff on Clayton. Let's talk about Clayton and where we are and how we got here. Clayton, back in 1970, the population was about 1,385. In 1980s, well, back in the mid-70s, you had Regency Woods and Clayton Greens was built. In the 1980s, you had the Oakhurst Country Club area was built, and we annexed the Clayton Woods and Regency Meadows, Dana Hills, and Dana Ridge. And we had some growth population in the 80s to 4,300. In the 1990s, we finished the completion of Oakhurst. We added Dabble Village, Stranahan, and Diamond Terrace. And we got to 10,700 in 2000. 10 years later, not much has changed. And very little has changed in 2020. Clayton remains pretty much, essentially built out. We got 95% of the land built out of housing stock, and the vast majority is single family homes. And that's kind of where we are, but as I said, lots of things are coming down that could challenge that. And I'm going to turn it over to Terry to talk about what exactly RENA is.
All right, thank you for that, Peter. We will now launch into our second poll question. All right. Do you believe there is a housing crisis in California? All right, and while you are answering that, we will ask some questions of the panelists. So, Tuya, what are the ramifications of the housing crisis?
Yeah, so from what I know and what I've read, there's plenty of evidence that as a state, we have a shortage of housing. In terms of the number of housing units per resident, California ranks 49th in the country, second to last. Another way of looking at this is to look at how many new jobs are we creating for every new housing unit that's being built. A healthy balance is somewhere around 1.5 new jobs to every 1 new housing unit. The ratio in the Bay Area since 2011 has been about 4.3 new jobs for every 1 new housing unit. So when we talk about the housing crisis, it's also important to consider the proximity of jobs and transit in terms of how people move between jobs and housing. When you look at Contra Costa County, we don't have a lot of huge job centers. The Silicon Valley tech jobs are not relocating to Concord or any other Contra Costa city. And then when you look at specifically Clayton, we really don't have a lot of jobs at all. And our public transit options are quite limited as well. So when you look and talk about the housing crisis, it is, it's more than just the market. It's more than just the market driving up the housing costs. It really is sort of a supply and demand issue. There are plenty of facts and figures that provide that when we don't have enough housing near jobs, it drives up the housing cost near those jobs as well as elsewhere, which in turn requires people to commute more in order to find housing in places where they can afford it. In terms of numbers, only 1/3 of Californians can afford a median priced home, when nationally, half of the population can afford that. In California and Bay Area, we have extremely high amount of homelessness. And in terms of bringing it back to Clayton, you know, we don't have a lot of homeless people in Clayton, and most of our residents are homeowners, so we've already been able to afford our homes in Clayton. But even though those of us who already have a home in Clayton are perhaps not impacted by the housing costs, since maybe we bought a home 10, 15, 30 years ago, our kids probably are. You know, I bought my very first home. It was a 3-bedroom home in Concord for $185,000. And as a 25-year-old, I had a decent job and the down payment was absolutely manageable. But that was in 1998. And I think the next generation, our kids, will have a much tougher time buying their first homes, even if they make 6-figure incomes, unless they have help from their parents. But I think beyond those facts, you know, we may not seem homelessness. A lot of us are homeowners already. The one thing that absolutely impacts all of us is traffic and greenhouse gas emissions. As a result of people commuting longer in order to travel between the homes they can afford and the jobs that pay for them. So when we talk about the housing crisis, it really is a discussion of 3 things: housing, jobs, and transportation. But regardless of whether we actually agree whether there's a housing crisis or not, one way or another, we are experiencing the impacts. And as cities, we have a lot of mandates coming from Sacramento to address the housing crisis.
All right, thanks for that, Tuya. Let's see what our audience believes. 70% of the audience says, yes, there's a housing crisis. Let's see, we got 5%, but Clayton doesn't have a role in solving it since the city's built out already. 10%, yes, but only cities with more jobs should be forced to develop, and 15% says no. All right, well, thank you guys for answering that question. Let me throw that over to you, Peter. What do you think? Do you believe there's a housing crisis?
Yeah, well, does it even matter what I think? I mean, honestly, I mean, Governor Newsom has made it his priority. It's the housing is #1 priority. I mean, what we really need is local cities to work together and their informed constituents. And we need our residents and our cities and our regional planners to get together to minimize these impacts from legislative onslaughts. I mean, we need to help our community somehow maintain the character of who we are in the best way we can. And that's going to take everybody to be involved.
Thanks for that, Peter. We will now jump over to the RHNA discussion. And give me a second here. There we go. All right. So RHNA, RHNA stands for Regional Housing Needs Assessment. We're going to talk about the RHNA. How does that process work, and how do we develop our housing element and get that certified? Okay, so what this is every 8 years, the HCD, the Housing Community Developments, which is part of the state, they look out and they do a projection of what are the housing needs going to be in the next 8 years, based on the number of jobs and people moving to the area. They determine that need. At the same time, the region determines the need as well, and then they come together and they look at the 2 numbers and they decide which route do they need to go, the state numbers or the regional numbers. The state law mandates that the state can take priority, and they usually do. The state numbers are usually higher than the regional numbers. So then the states will then carry those regional numbers down to the Regional Council of Governments for the Bay Area. That is the Association of Bay Area Governments, which is ABAG. And the Council of Governments will spend time figuring out how are they going to divvy up those allocations to the individual jurisdictions. They'll develop the methodology of how to do that, and then roll those out to the individual cities. The city will then get that number, and they will have to work on a plan to determine, a realistic plan to determine how are they going to meet the needs of the housing numbers that they've been asked to develop. Okay, the city doesn't actually build the houses. They just have to create a plan that says, if I have 141 that I need to account for, this is how I would do it by this zoning. So you'll see here, I've put a link down here at the bottom. So when you get these slides, you can take a look at. This is a snippet of our general plan from the city of Clayton. This is kind of our overarching strategy document. This shows all of the parcels in the city and the different zoning involved with each parcel. So the city will determine how do they need to zone accordingly so that they can meet the numbers that they've been given by the state. They will put that plan together, and it's an iterative process with the state where they work out whether their plan is going to be considered accepted or not. If it is accepted, it's considered certified. And then every year cities are required, jurisdictions are required to submit an annual progress report. So as Peter mentioned earlier, we're about to, we're coming close to entering the 6th cycle of the RENA process. We're currently in the 5th cycle. So I'm just going to walk through the planning process that we used in the 5th cycle as a good example to help people understand what this process looks like. So in the 5th cycle, we were assigned 141 units that we needed to plan for. And we were also assigned different percentages that we need to consider at these different income levels. So it's not just go build 141 mansions. It's a mixture of extremely low, very low, low, moderate, and above moderate incomes that could afford those houses. And this breakout is also determined at the regional level by AVAG. So we were assigned 141 units in the breakdown that I've showed here in the slide, which for reference point, we were less than 1% of the total Contra Costa County 5th cycle RENA requirements. So although we are a small city and hitting 141 was a challenging feat for us, neighboring cities like Concord and Walnut Creek were in the thousands. So how do they do this process? So the city planners then get this number, they evaluate all of the land within the city limits, and then figure out how do they create a plan. These are not projects that exist today, so they have to make some assumptions about what kind of project could fit where, and they have to use some criteria to determine if a project was there, it would be able to accommodate this number of houses. So what you'll see is in the 5th cycle, our city planners put together a RENA plan that included planned and approved projects. So these are projects that had come forward in prior years, had gotten approved and didn't end up going through. I think in both cases they were because the developer had financial difficulties and went under, and they weren't able to finish the projects. But the projects can be carried forward with another developer. So we've got planned or approved projects, vacant land, so parcels that don't have any buildings on them today, and then underdeveloped sites. So meaning that there's already something built there, but their land is large enough that that we could build more on there. So if you look in the general, or if you look in the housing element, you'll see this map way in the back, page 119, the last page in the housing element. And this is a map of all of the parcels that were used in that RENA process that I just showed you. So this is in blue here, you've got the couple of approved projects, in orange the vacant land, and in yellow the underutilized land that we have in the city. So the planners look at what is our total available land that we can consider, what are the numbers we need to meet, and then the criteria that they use to estimate what's the realistic amounts that I could build on there comes from the California government code that I cite here, 65583.2. So for example, the 65583.2 C3B3, that is a guidance in the code that suggests that if you are looking to zone houses that will target the lower income levels, then the suggestion is to use a minimum density of 20 dwellings or 20 dwelling units per acre. So high density housing, essentially. So because high density housing in the state default is better apt for lower incomes, because you need to have a realistic plan. So that's kind of the key with the housing element. So the plan has got to be realistic, and the state's got to feel like it's realistic, or they're not going to approve it. So you can't take some super small plot of land and say, I'm going to build a 100-unit apartment complex right here on there, and now I've met my numbers. They'll continue the iterative process and come back and say that doesn't cut it, that doesn't work. So this is how they put that, all the pieces of that puzzle together to be able to create that plan. Okay, so a lot of people have asked, okay, well, we're a small city and we don't have, we're built out. Where are we going to put these houses? Doesn't the state understand we don't have anywhere to put these? Why do we need to do this? Why do we need to have a compliant housing element? So there were a lot of cities that were saying this, especially in the last RHNA cycle and the 5th RHNA cycle. So from what I understand, every cycle, the requirements, the number of houses you have to plan for has gone up. And there were 47 cities in the state of California in the 5th cycle that said, I'm not doing it. I'm not going to put together a plan that's compliant for whatever reason. So what you see here in this chart over here, these were the cities that at the beginning of 2019 did not have a compliant plan. The larger circles are they're more populated cities. The smaller ones are the lower populated cities. So Governor Newsom, recognizing that this is his #1 priority, he made an example of Huntington Beach. That was one city that had decided that they weren't going to have any affordable housing, and that was making their housing element non-compliant. They were not going to plan for affordable housing, and they were going to see, what are you going to do about it? And Newsom sent a lawsuit their way. And in his 2019 State of the State address, Governor Newsom called out Huntington Beach. And he also called out this little small city named Wheatland, which is a rural farming town up in Yuba City area, population less than 3,500. And essentially said, hey, if you don't want to be like Huntington Beach, guys, get on board. And after that time, most of the cities brought their housing elements into compliance. There's really just a few that are stragglers that are out there. Most are either in the process of it and working through it. I think there's only 1 or 2 that are left that have not. So aside from potential lawsuits coming from the state, also a non-compliant housing element, it can result in penalties. It can result in us, or any jurisdiction, not being able to get access to state funds. It can also affect some of our regional funds. So for example, a lot of our monies that go toward paving our roads come from regional funds. That could be at risk if we did not put forward a compliant housing element. So the worst case scenario, I think, is we could lose more local control. That's not out of the question, and it's what happened to Huntington Beach. So Huntington Beach settled, and the state came forward with them and asked them to build, I think it was over 500 units affordable housing, and they lost control over being able to have much say on that. So these are all things that we need to consider smartly as these numbers start to come our way and we start to plan for them. Is, we have an opportunity to be smart about how we make these decisions, but looking out on, looking out further and understanding the consequences of our decisions, becomes really key as well. Okay, so Tuya will talk a little bit about where we're going with the 6th cycle of the RHNA.
Yeah, so here's a schedule for the Bay Area itself. So, and this is the timeline for the 6th RHNA cycle, which is the one that's being developed right now. So the Bay Area as a region has now received its figure from the state, and we received that figure in June. It was received by ABAC, and the number of new housing units that the Bay Area as a whole has to develop in the next cycle, or has to plan for in the next cycle, is about 414,000 units. That is much higher than what the number was for the Bay Area in the prior cycle. In the 5th cycle, Bay Area's figure was about 179,000 units. So in the current stage where exactly we are right now, ABAC is working through figuring out what is the criteria by which we divide the 414,000 units among all the 91 Bay Area cities. So based on some of the discussions that have happened at ABAC and at regional level, there seems to be at least 2 competing approaches under discussion in terms of the division to cities. And there's a huge difference between, for example, what South Bay wants and what Contra Costa County wants. One approach looks at the 2019 baseline, and the other one looks at the planned Bay Area 2050 roadmap, which is really based more on where the jobs are located, and an approach that actually reduces greenhouse gas emissions, because you're not locating more of the housing in areas where we don't have as many jobs, like Contra Costa County. So the difference between those 2 approaches is several hundred units as far as Clayton is concerned. And I know regionally, Contra Costa leaders, including our mayor, Julie Pierce, are advocating for the approach that's based on the planned Bay Area 2050 roadmap, which would result in lower figures for Contra Costa County and all of its cities. But so in terms of the big picture, once the methodology has been decided by ABAC, then Clayton, like all other cities, will get our figure. We'll get our draft figure this fall. We'll get our final figure in December. And at that point, Clayton, sort of during 2021, Clayton will need to update its housing element to accommodate for the number of units that are assigned for us. So I'll stop there, and I think we have another poll question we're going to do.
Yep. Okay. Choose the answers that are true. Can be more than one. A city may need to upzone accordingly in order to create a compliant housing element plan. That's A. B, cities only need to create a plan to meet their RHNA targets. They do not need to develop. That's B. C, cities can choose not to submit a compliant plan because they are in a small and/or a rural community or lack of transit to jobs proximity. And D, cities must build out their entire plan. And E went off of my screen. Hopefully you guys can see it. Okay, good. All right. All right, and while you guys are doing that poll, we will swap back over to the slide deck, and Tuya will talk to us a little bit about the changing landscape that's happening in Sacramento.
Yeah, and I think I was quickly going to maybe wrap up the RHNA discussion in terms of what's happening. So again, you know, and this is, you know, when we, so the RHNA figure, you know, is essentially the anticipated need for new housing, and the cities need to plan for it, but the cities are not required to build. We as cities don't build housing, but we are required to identify a sufficient number of vacant or underutilized sites where the new units could be built. So there are 2 components to that. We need to show that we can accommodate the total number, and like I said, like Terry said, in the last cycle, that was 141 units. And then also we need to accommodate for the number of lower income units, which for Clayton in the last cycle was 76. If the existing zoning already allows for the construction of the units, then we're done. But if the existing zoning for the identified parcel is lower in terms of density, then cities may have to upzone. But thereafter, any property owner or developer could certainly propose a project at one of these sites. And at that point, it's a different set of laws that kicks in to guide when and how a city could reject a housing project at those sites. And I think specifically in the last few years, the Housing Accountability Act is one set of legislation that has really dictated when a city can say no to a housing project. And legally, under the Housing Accountability Act, there's essentially 3 criteria that apply. And one is that the project has to meet the objective general plan and zoning standards. So for example, if we have a height limit that applies that's 35 feet, somebody could not build a 60-foot tall building. Second, the city cannot say no unless the project causes a significant adverse impact to public health and safety, which is a very tough standard to meet. And then third, the project needs to comply with CEQA and the California Coastal Act. So I'll stop there, and I think we were going to take the results from the poll. Let's see.
There we go. All right, so first one, a city may need to upzone accordingly in order to create a compliant housing element. That is true. Cities only need to create a plan to meet their RHNA targets. They do not need to develop. That is also true. Cities can choose not to submit a compliant plan because they are small or in rural communities, or they lack transit or jobs proximity. That is not true. That's what happened with Huntington Beach and the other 47. And cities must build out their entire plan before the cycle is complete. That's not true. They just need to create the plan. It doesn't need to actually be built toward. And then the last one, E, there's no penalties to a non-compliant plan. And good, we've got nobody answering true. That is also a false question. All right, so now we'll bridge over into the changing landscape with Tuya.
So thank you. So I think the very first slide that we're going to see here on the screen, this is just a snapshot of the number of housing-related bills that were introduced this January in Sacramento for the 2019-2020 legislative session. Not all of them will get approved. Some of them have already died in committee, but when you look at it, the number of proposals alone is tremendous. And what this shows that it's not just one state senator or a state assembly member who's pushing for more housing legislation. What this shows visually is that Sacramento is serious about fixing the housing crisis. And we're not the only small city or the only city that doesn't have transit services or the job centers in our town. The challenge is, how do we advocate for state legislation that's not a one-size-fits-all answer, and instead takes into account some of the differences between cities and locations? Based on sort of what I've seen over the years, I don't think it's realistic for us to assume that the state legislator would accept that Clayton has no role whatsoever in the solutions to housing crisis. But surely we as a city can be effective in advocating for certain revisions to new housing legislation that is moving forward. So very importantly, this is not scare or fear-based tactics. What it comes down to is that if we don't understand how the landscape has changed in the last 5 or so years, and if we continue to operate how we've done 5, 10, 15 years ago, we are merely asking to fight fights that we are not going to win, and all of the consequences are going to be borne by us. And many of those consequences are financial, and they will only hurt the wallet, our wallet as a city, which in turn can then impact the services that we're able to provide. So it's kind of like, when your kid tells you they're not going to clean their room, it's their room, no one else has to look at it, and your kid likes it just the way it is. But as a parent, you know that they will clean their room, and that this time you really mean it. So, so you also know that the more your kid resists and the longer it takes for him or her to clean their room, not only will you tell them to clean their room, they will also lose their allowance, and you might also make them clean the downstairs bathroom. So this kind of, represents what has happened at the state level in the last few years. if we submit a housing element that does not comply with the state laws, and we tell the state, hey, we don't want to do that, the state no longer allows us to get away with it. So if we can go to the next slide and talk a little bit about what has changed. Some things have changed, have stayed the same. So the requirement for Clayton to submit a housing element to the state and to plan for housing, that's been around for decades. And up until 5 years ago, cities could use local legislation quite a bit to restrict housing development through zoning, height limits, setback requirements, and other criteria based on what we wanted. And in terms of some of the legislation, the Housing Accountability Act has been around since 1982, but it really was not as strong as it is today, and it was not used by advocates as it is today. Another example is the state density bonus law has not been utilized that much at all before 2016. San Francisco, where I do a lot of my work, did not have its first state density bonus project until late 2016, but since then they've had plenty. So in the last few years, there's also been an increase in housing advocacy groups, and they are paying close attention when cities are about to reject housing projects. We've had organizations look at Clayton very closely too, and some of them have even participated in our hearings. There's also been more litigation in the last couple of years, and from litigation, we get more precedent that doesn't look great for cities that are not complying with state law. And to bring a close example, Olivia project is an example of what has happened at the state level in the last few years that has essentially superseded local control at some level. When those parcels were rezoned in 2012, I wasn't personally part of that decision as I was living in Finland at the time, but the council had voted to allow up to 60 units in order to comply with the 4th RINA cycle, and had rezoned them for high density housing, 20 units an acre, in order to satisfy the low income requirement, and overall to get the state to accept the housing element at that time. Based on the meeting minutes and sort of what has happened legislatively in the state since 2012, there's no way anyone, including the developer in 2012, would have known or foreseen that this site could instead be developed with 81 units and 3 stories. And that's because of 2 things that have happened since then that have nothing to do with Clayton. So first, although the state density bonus law also has existed for decades, it has not been used for market rate projects for until the last few years. So there's absolutely no way anybody would have known in 2012, including the developer, that you could do a market rate project where you could add a 35% bonus on top of existing zoning that the city provided and exceed the density limits and provide 81 units and 3 stories. The other thing that has changed and also impacted the Olivia project is the Housing Accountability Act. Similarly, it has existed for decades, but it has not been used to force cities to approve projects until recently. The findings that the cities have to make under the Housing Accountability Act after approximately 2016 in order to deny a project are very difficult. And we saw that in the Olivia project. No one, including our city attorney, was able to articulate any of those findings that would have been required under the Housing Accountability Act. So let's go to the next slide. And here's a slide that gives some examples of what has actually changed in the legislation. We could talk about this for the next 2 hours. So this is just sort of a very high level, big picture thing of the types of things that have changed at the state legislative level. In 2016, there were 4 pieces of legislation that addressed the Housing Accountability Act. Those included tightening the objective standard definition so that a project that's consistent, essentially with zoning that the city provides, can only be denied if there's a specific adverse impact on health and safety. The Housing Accountability Act also gave courts the ability to order a project approved, and in the case of an improper denial, and it allows for attorney's fees. And in the case of bad faith on the city's part, the city can be fined a minimum of $10,000 per unit and a maximum of $50,000 per unit. Another example is SB 35. which allows for ministerial approvals if a city has not made sufficient progress towards the RINA numbers, keeping in mind we must allocate and plan for the RINA numbers. We're not required to build, but if no one builds, as a city, we haven't, quote unquote, made enough progress towards our RINA numbers. So a project that is submitted under SB 35 gets approved without CEQA review and at staff level. There are no discretionary hearings at all on those projects. The density bonus laws have also been clarified, and this is an example where the local zoning controls regarding density and height and other development standards can be superseded. Another example that was passed last year is SB 330, which prohibits cities from downzoning a parcel unless at the same time we also upzone another parcel. And the reason for this legislation is that now that cities realize that there are laws that allow projects to exceed cities' local controls or to obtain ministerial approvals, the protective action on the city's part would be to downzone heights and densities. But SB 330 came along and said, no, you can't downzone unless you also do essentially a one-for-one upzone somewhere else in the city. So I think the sum of this is that one of the challenges that Clayton faces, along with many other cities, is that there's an increasing trend to take away local control. The housing crisis itself has been in the works for decades, and many in our state leadership believe that cities have not done their parts. So some of the legislation that we see coming out of Sacramento really attempts to address the housing crisis from the perspective of not allowing cities to say no to projects, not allowing cities to downzone properties, overriding the city's zoning on height and density, and not letting cities get away with not submitting compliant housing elements. So that is sort of the quick summary of what the landscape looks like and how it has changed, especially in the last 5 years. And it's really important for us to understand that so that we can figure out how can we in Clayton be the most effective in preserving Clayton as a small and charming town. So I'll stop there, and I think we do another poll question.
Thank you, Tyria. That's very insightful. A lot of changes in the last 5 years. It's almost hard to keep up with, for certain. All right. Next poll question here. As a resident, what can I do to help preserve the character of Clayton? And you can choose more than one here. So stay informed about the changing legislative state landscape, get involved in the planning workshops when the housing element is being developed. If you don't like the state policies you're seeing, engage your state senators or state assembly members. Help your neighbors to stay engaged and informed. A, B, C, and D, nothing. Clayton is doomed. And show the state we mean business by not submitting a compliant housing element, and reject projects that don't fit the character of the city. So pick as many as you'd like to choose. All righty then. Now I think we are going to go to some audience questions. Peter will facilitate that.
So we have questions, and one of the first questions that was asked was, do we know of any city or municipality that has successfully sued Sacramento, challenging the RINA and won?
So maybe I can take that a little bit. So, you know, when cities, so like I said, in the fall, Clayton and every other city will get their draft figure. In December, we will get a final RINA figure. But then what happens is there is an appeal period. So cities can submit appeals to the HCD, the Housing and Community Development, the state agency, and they can appeal their figure and say, provide whatever justification they have for getting a lower number. So I know appeals can be submitted. I have not carefully tracked how successful those have been.
One of the questions was, if we legally fight Sacramento, how much can we realistically lose in dollars relative to legal cost? And the corollary question to that is, if we do, what type of city services do we risk losing or reducing due to that? a tough
Gosh,
one.
how much could we lose in dollars?
I mean,
Millions?
you mentioned $15.75 million.
Millions? Millions. And if you look at if you were attending the recent budget discussions in the city council, you'll see that that we have a reserve of about $5 million. So millions goes pretty quick. And about 50% of our budget goes to our police force. So it's not too far into it that you're in the situation of potentially having to cut services. So if we're talking about, if we're talking about the project I talked to you about earlier, almost $16 million, that's not something that a small city like Clayton can afford.
And I think that's really the crux of it. There are larger cities that have larger budgets. They can at times afford to put in a couple $1 million or whatever the amount is into litigation and fight something. It's really tough for a city the size of Clayton. Our general fund is very small at $5 million. It takes about $5 million a year for us to operate and provide the services we provide, which include the police services you mentioned, Terry. So it's extremely tough if we end up spending some of our annual income on litigation. We have to make up the money somehow else. One option is to increase taxes. Not a great option. And then the other thing is we do have reserves too, but we live in earthquake country. We live in right next to open space where we can have wildfires. So we need to have some reserves for any kind of unexpected scenarios that could happen. So it's not very smart to spend our reserves on litigation. But I think the bottom line is if we're going to litigate something, let's at least be sure that we're going to be on the winning side. There's no point in litigating something that has already been tried by other cities and lost. So I think we just need to at least be very certain that we're going to win that litigation if we take that chance.
Yeah, and Peter, I know your question was about the housing element, but there's an increasing trend of cities approving projects according to the housing accountability law. There have been a few that I have seen recently that have rejected projects and have been sued by some of those housing advocacy groups. There is one city that I've seen that has come back and appealed it and has spent millions of dollars on legal fees, and I'm watching closely to see if they're successful. But at least in the last 5 years, it's been very difficult to find legal precedent of folks being successful in these challenges.
There's a couple questions really good regarding ABAG. Who are they? And do we have, as a city, any significant impact on their decisions relative to RENA numbers?
So ABAG is the Association of Bay Area Governments. It is essentially a collaborative regional agency that works for all the 91 cities and counties in the Bay Area. In terms of representation, it's a collaborative regional agency. There are various different representatives in that organization and within the different committees they have. Contra Costa County has among them one representative that represents the Contra Costa County in some of the committees. For many years, that's been our mayor, Julie Pierce. So in some ways, we've been very lucky to have somebody very local who is out there advocating for Contra Costa County and Clayton.
And it's my understanding is that she has been advocating for lower numbers and actually has been successful in that, because there's a saying that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And clearly, we don't need higher numbers. We're trying to keep the numbers as low as possible in our allocation with the rest of the Bay Area cities.
Yeah, and I can imagine when we talk about the RENA numbers specifically, so the Bay Area has a huge number, 414,000 units as a whole. Every region, sub-region within the Bay Area wants smaller numbers. So there's definitely competing interests within the Bay Area alone in terms of what those numbers should be. I do personally think that the approach that the Contra Costa County is taking in this cycle to look at the Plan Bay Area 2050 roadmap is the right approach, because it really looks at where is the growth in the Bay Area in the next 30 years likely to go, you know, and it really is, you know, closer to jobs like the Silicon Valley jobs. So, and it really bases the allocation of the RINA figures based on that. Where are the jobs? That's where the housing units should be as well.
So there's actually 101 cities and 9 counties in ABAG. So that gives you an idea of the enormity of the organization.
Yep. Absolutely, absolutely, and just to add to Turia's comment about the work that's being done at the regional level, looking at the 2 different baselines, the Planned Bay Area and the 2019 baseline, you know, just to give a kind of a gut feel for the differences, we could be looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of 600 or 800 as our RENA number by one count, or 200 something as our RENA number by another count. And we're lucky to have folks like Julie out there advocating for Planned Bay Area, which, as Tuia said, really puts the requirement where the jobs are and where the jobs are.
Yeah, and I think lastly, it really emphasizes the importance that we work with not only our own residents, but also with some of our neighboring cities. We're not the only ones in this situation. And some of our neighboring cities, yes, some of them have BART stations and other things, but overall, they're in a fairly similar situation as well.
And the last question that was kind of interesting was the difference between city-owned property and privately owned property in terms of how these housing laws are put forth. Is there a difference?
So in terms of the housing element and allocating and identifying sites for housing, there is no difference in that sense. Obviously, if the city owns a site, we have greater control over that site in terms of what is developed on that and what is not. You know, when we have private sites, privately owned sites, the city will zone those and maybe identify those as opportunity sites in the housing element. And then we don't know what happens. A developer could decide to develop them, and at that point, we don't have much control. When it's done on city-owned properties, we have more control over what happens to those sites.
We have an answer, or?
All right, so. Okay, so the majority picked E, and what this is showing me is that I forgot to hit the toggle switch that allows you to pick multiple choices. Or we've got a lot of folks that are really well educated here. So appreciate everyone and jumping into the polls. All right, so let me stop sharing that. And I think we have one more poll question.
Yes.
Bear with us here. Okay, what topics would you like to see in future webinars? We have talked about doing a discussion about the Olivia project and asking questions that folks are interested in knowing about. Are you interested in learning a little more about the RENA process, a little more about the housing element process, potentially more about what's going on in housing legislation and the Housing Accountability Act, or if we didn't get any of these right, please send us an email and let us know what it is that you're interested in. We are going to pick the future topics based on what we hear from the folks interested in attending.
Do you have a toggle so multiple answers can be made?
It should be.
Okay. I'm getting an answer, a note that's saying multiple answers not allowed. Just I'm throwing it out there.
I may have forgot to put that toggle in too. I apologize. Well,
Please,
if you want
reach out
multiple
to
answers, if you want multiple answers, then the homework is to send me an email and let us know, please. I apologize. I must have forgotten to hit the button on the last 2 poll questions here. All right, so then that's taking us to the end of our discussion tonight. So we'll wrap up here with some closing remarks and kick that off from Peter.
So one of the questions asked, is Clayton too small, basically, to really have a voice in regional politics or a regional voice? No, I don't believe we're too small. We have some very intelligent people in Clayton and strong professionals. I know that from firsthand experience from dealing with a group of men and women who were in my small neighborhood coalition. I'm not even talking about all Clayton, just in my neighborhood around the Silver Oak Project, that were able to get together and dissect and come up with great arguments and answers to actually counter what was given as fact in front of the Planning Commission and the City Council. We can do this. We also have some great representatives who are out there advocating on behalf of Clayton in AVAG, in our regional government. We're not too small. What I'm begging all of you who are listening tonight is to really stay informed, watch. We need you. We need you to help form and craft who we are in this next RENA cycle. We need you to help make it so we don't lose Clayton. And so the state doesn't take over and mandate things because we're not being proactive enough. Yeah.
Thanks, Peter. Mine is short and sweet. Stay engaged, stay educated. We get better solutions when we work together on this. And Tuya?
Yeah, so I think for me, it really echoes some along the same lines. You know, I think it is important for all of us to be educated. I think it's important for us to understand the landscape of what is happening and what has happened in the last 5 years. I absolutely strongly believe that if we have more of our residents involved, armed with information, that we are able to find ways to be constructive and effective and to have a voice that actually gets heard. And really, that's really the point of this webinar series. You know, I've also heard, let's simply say no, or let's offer to fight the state at all costs. It's really not effective, in my opinion, in 2020. It sounds great, it's very appealing, but we have plenty of examples of cities in California who have done that and ended up being the kid who not only cleans their room, gets assigned extra work, loses their allowance, and gets excluded from the table where the decisions are made. So I really don't want Clayton to be that kid. Our budget is too small. We need to be smart about how we can be effective. And part of that starts with education. I really would like to see future planning commission and city council meetings on housing topics or anything else for that matter, and including the hearings we're about to have on the housing element and the next RENA cycle, to involve more of our citizens and for all of us to sort of brainstorm this together in a way that advocates for what's important to Clayton. So I'm hoping too that our residents will stay informed, stay educated, and and attend our hearings.
Thanks, Tuya. As I mentioned in the beginning, it can make the difference between a Terraces project or a Deer Hill project, and getting what's a better fit for your community. All right, so surprise, surprise, people want to hear about the Olivia project.
Let's do it.
That's what I expected to hear. So we will look to do that as our next webinar. Do feel free to send us questions, comments, and thank you guys. I know we went a little bit over time here. Appreciate it. Looks like we didn't have too much of a drop off in attendance, so that's great. So appreciate everybody staying on with us. Appreciate your interest in the topic, and looking forward to having our next discussion. Everyone have a good night.
Good night.
Good night.